So, what I'd like to talk about this evening is the relationship mainly between the solo violin part and orchestra of the works that you will hear. That's Sibelius and the Sibelius and Brahms violin concertos. You all know what a violin concerto is. It's a piece where the violinist is the soloist with an orchestra. A rather simplified internet definition of a concerto talks about the concerto as being something where the soloist is accompanied by the orchestra. I think you'll see in the concertos that we hear tonight that the orchestra does rather more than just accompany the solo part, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So first of all, I thought I'd mention a little bit about the background of the concerto form as we know it today. It goes back to the classical period, especially from the concertos of Mozart onwards. The concerto from this point onwards was really a vehicle to show off virtuosity and difficult technique by the soloist, and middle movement was a chance for the soloist to show their musical skill and finesse. Now, before I do go into talking about the classical concerto form, I'm just going to play a little bit, just a tiny bit, of the start of Mozart's fourth violin concerto. And this is a part played by the orchestra. Most of these classical concertos of contrast and character. So these themes are presented by the orchestra. The soloist can play along, but the soloist doesn't have a different part at this point. Then after this, the soloist comes in and plays you the solo part in this Mozart concerto. From half a minute ago. It's the same music as what the orchestra played. Different register. The orchestra started down low. Soloist up high. Immediately there's virtuosity added to the sound, isn't there? And anyone watching is able to see how high the left hand of the violinist is on the instrument. That's difficult, isn't it, to play up high? And the different figurations and ornamentation added almost immediately as well. So, the start of the concerto, the exposition, we'll call it, theme 1 and 2, was presented by the orchestra. After that, the same themes in the classical concerto could be expected to be presented by the soloist. Orchestra drops back a lot at this point, and does just light accompaniment, gives a chance for the soloist to really shine, show off what they can do, and with as much fancy technique as possible. This is especially the case once we get to concertos of the early 19th century, virtuosic. That was really the heyday of virtuosic concertos written by soloists to play themselves. Think of Paganini. And on from a slightly different time, but just to give you an idea of some of the character of these violinists, I'd like to mention a quote by, Wieniawski's motto, "One must take risks." Wieniawski was a great violinist, and imagine him playing with this motto foremost in his mind. That would add rather a degree of virtuosity to the playing, wouldn't it? So, as I mentioned, the beginning of the 19th century had many virtuosic concertos written. There was quite a difference in the playing between the orchestral part and the solo part. Solo parts were full of all sorts of interesting and very difficult technical things such as arpeggios and in case of Paganini, double stops and harmonics, double stopping harmonics in fact. As the century progressed though, composers sought to find a way to make the concerto form less two-dimensional, less one-sided, and more of a musical complete form, where the solo and the orchestral parts were integrated in a way to create a real musical whole. And Beethoven's Violin Concerto of 1806 is slightly less of a vehicle for virtuosity, but rather one for real musical intent. The violinist embellishes the musical material, which is presented by the orchestra. I've got to give Amalia something to do here. So I'll skip to the middle of the 19th century. Remember back to the classical concerto form that I was just talking about, where the orchestra does the first exposition, first part of the double exposition, and then the soloist does the second part. Can you, just for an instant please, imagine that you are a 19th century audience. You've come to hear a concerto, and you know you've got a long wait for the concerto soloist to come in, well, medium length wait. So settle back in your seats, and you think you've got all the time in the world to get ready to hear the soloist come in. You'll all recognise this concerto, but I want you just to listen to the start of it from a 19th century perspective. Soft notes of the orchestra, nearly this, and then the soloist bursts in with this impassioned melody over the top. To me, it gives a real breathless feel to the start of this concerto, with the soloist rushing in so early. Mendelssohn concerto introduced the idea that the soloist could potentially come in this early into a concerto, and a number of other innovations to create a more musical whole, such as different devices to go straight through the concerto without letting the audience clap between movements, which is what they would have expected to do, and different placement of the cadenza. Now, I've mentioned this concerto because the Sibelius concerto has something similar to Mendelssohn in its opening. Yes, a very soft beginning. It's actually even softer, or should be softer in the Sibelius concerto, pianissimo, and with mutes on. Amalia and I will demonstrate at the start of this concerto so you can get a feel for the mood of this before I move on with the rest of the movement. So it's just strings accompanying the soloist at the start. The soloist is really in a position of being very alone on stage. Calm, opening, oscillating string notes, they're barely there. I can't demonstrate all parts, unfortunately, just by myself. As the section progresses, it builds towards a diminished chord, a very uncertain point. And part of the nature of having the violin usher in this melody means that the musical responsibility of pulling off this opening material lies with the soloist. So when you're listening tonight, you can judge whether they are really taking full responsibility for this important responsibility. As I mentioned, it builds towards a diminished chord. Amalia and I will just play a diminished chord for those of you who'd like to know what it sounds like. Okay, that's not very settled or certain at all, is it? So after, I'll have Amalia demonstrate what the violin soloist does at this point. And the soloist has to lead the whole orchestra from that really uncertain, lonesome start to this very dramatic but still uncertain point in the movement. And does Sibelius resolve this question by doing something with the group as a whole? No, he leaves it up to the soloist, and the soloist has to, completely by themselves, wind down from what you'll hear with full orchestra as a really dramatic moment. I'll in the second half, Amalia play this cadenza. The cadenza is normally placed at the very end of a movement. Traditionally, around the last two notes, in fact. And this meant that it was rather like an add-on, and it was, in the classical period, Baroque period, cadenzas were improvised and really had a personal stamp on them. With later concertos, there definitely was a personal stamp, but this was not so much with notes, but rather with what the soloist did with musical intent. Having a cadenza at this point, so early in the concerto, is really quite unusual, and you can see it's got musical purpose here to come down from that dramatic moment I was just talking to you about. So I'll have Amalia play this first cadenza. time just to get this angst that was left over from the previous part where the orchestra finished out of the system of the audience. I think it's like. Sibelius was a wannabe violin virtuoso. In a letter he wrote when he was 50, he said, "Dreamt last night I was a 12-year-old virtuoso." So that dream stayed with him his whole life. In this concerto, his only concerto, he is really showing everything that he would have loved to have been able to do as a soloist, I feel. And the concerto is very much a dazzling virtuoso piece, as well as something that shows real symphonic breadth. And you'll have seen an enormous orchestra on stage to help support that idea. I'll leave you to count the number of players on stage. So, when Sibelius first wrote his concerto, it was much longer than what it is today. It had an extra cadenza in, rather like Bach in it. You can still see string crossing in that cadenza, rather like string crossing you might see in solo Bach. So, this is one of the more difficult works for conductors, one of the more difficult concertos for conductors to cope with in orchestras. We have a fantastic conductor in orchestra tonight, so there won't be any issues at all here. But you'd be interested to hear some of the complexities that orchestra soloists have to deal with. So after the cadenza, that first cadenza that Amalia demonstrated, the orchestra finally gets a chance to really show its symphonic self. Then going into the second subject, that second theme that I discussed, can be expected in the classical concerto. We hear one of these rhythmic difficulties. Orchestral part has 6 beats in the bar. Now 4 beats in the bar in the same space of time. Listen to the violin. And this leads into the second subject. The second subject is something that normally would be played with real contrast to the first subject. Think back to the opening of the concerto. Muted strings, very little happening on stage. Soloist playing a lonesome, plaintive melody. The second subject is full of double stops, 6 flats. Flats add warmth to the sound of the violin. It's an impassioned, warm moment. Extremely different, and it's up to the soloist to create real difference of character between the first and the second subject in any musical work. From the icy opening to that warm melody that we just heard. Okay, another rhythmic complexity comes up at this point, which you will all notice because it's a duet between the viola, lead viola player, and the soloist. And it's the same thing goes on as the part we just played to you a moment ago. 6 beats in the bar against 4 beats in the bar. I will play the viola part on a violin because it's easier than carrying 2 instruments around. This concerto, this concerto is full of technical tricks and difficulties. And the one coming up to at this point in the music is octaves. Octaves is something which violin students find excruciating. It's so hard to get in tune. Many hours of microtones to be heard under the ear before most violin students master octaves. The violinist now has octaves that need to float in the air with incredible delicacy and poise. Another virtuosic technique which Sibelius uses and many composers have used is extremes of register. You hear this in the orchestra, in every orchestral, just about every orchestral part in this concerto, in fact, not just the solo part. And a lot of very low, rumbly writing as well, so listen out for that. I'll have Amalia play a short excerpt which demonstrates the huge variety and range. And places like that are a chance for the soloist to really show that they are doing something virtuosic. And in a classical concerto, there are three main sections. The exposition, as I mentioned, at the very end of the movement, basically a return of the exposition. In the middle section is the development, where those two subjects, the two main musical ideas, are developed and changed around and explored in a really interesting way. Sibelius doesn't have a traditional development here. As a composer, he intended to use development in a rather different way to other composers of a more classical form. And in this concerto, we have the cadenza, the main cadenza, placed in a really unusual place, not at the end of the movement, where the classical concerto soloists would expect to place their cadenza and could insert anything they wanted, really. It could be an unrelated piece, in fact. But it's been moved much earlier, and this is something Mendelssohn did as well. The cadenza, the real fancy part for the soloist, has been put in the very centre of the movement, so it becomes suddenly an essential part of the musical structure. I'll have Amalia play just a little, very small part of the main cadenza. Recognise that melody? Let's right back to that opening melody. Cadenzas are normally parts of the concerto that do use the main melodies of the music, and having this cadenza really central in the middle of the movement means that the soloist has a chance to be almost part of the development. This cadenza is almost in lieu of a development section. So the soloist here needs to play a cadenza which is showy and shows off what they can do, but also really has a seriousness about it that ties together the whole movement. And this is one of the many aspects of this work that make it so difficult for the soloist. I'll just mention a little bit about Brahms' concerto. Brahms's concerto is a work of the classical mould, classical form that I have mentioned many times this evening, with the double exposition. You'll hear a long orchestral opening. Rather like the Beethoven's violin concerto, the soloist has the opportunity to support what the orchestra is doing, rather than be purely that upfront virtuosic soloist who expects the whole orchestra to just be really in accompanying mode. So, Amalia and I will demonstrate, I'm skipping around a bit, Amalia and I will demonstrate the second subject of Brahms' violin concerto. And I will be taking the orchestral melody, and you'll see that the solo violin part is weaving around this and supporting it. So here again, Brahms concerto as well as Sibelius concerto, we have soloist and orchestra working together to create a musical whole. Soloist isn't able just to do their own thing. They need to be listening to the orchestra, hearing what's happening musically, how the melodies are being performed by the orchestral musicians, and playing a way that supports that. Brahms' concerto is full of difficulties such as double stops and tenths. Amalia, could you play a tenth just to show the audience what it is? Okay, so what Amalia just played is actually rather difficult. Could you see the position of the hand and how spread the fingers are? It's not easy. So Brahms has all these difficulties, all for musical reasons. It's as though he's put them there because he felt the music had to be that way. Certainly not because they are just inserted as a point to show off what the violinist can do. Brahms did have a fantastic violinist he was writing for, Joseph Joachim, who certainly could do anything that Brahms put in front of him, and I imagine that would have been encouragement to write or not rein in any violinistic difficulties that he wanted to put on the page. So, as you can see, both the concertos tonight are musical partnerships between orchestra and soloist. And this soloist has responsibility to lead the orchestra in interpretation, but as well as that, listen to everything that is presented musically in the orchestra and support that, from hearing the orchestral exposition in the Brahms concerto to leading the orchestra in the start of Sibelius' concerto. There is huge responsibility on behalf of the soloist to be leading this enormous team that you will see on stage. And in today's age, we're rather lucky that conductors are almost always willing to support the soloist wonderfully in the soloist interpretation. Wasn't always the case. There's a wonderful story about Mendelssohn, the Mendelssohn concerto being performed by Menuhin. Menuhin wanted to finish the Mendelssohn rather fast, and the conductor disagreed, refused to. Half the orchestra finished at a totally different time to Menuhin. In fact, half a page is different, so real chaos on stage. Anyway, I hope you have understood some of these points this evening. You'll all hear these things instinctively, but you'll be able to also do some conscious listening, I hope, to the wonderful